Chloe sat in the front row of the funeral, trying to get through the ceremony without drawing attention and showing a strength she didn't truly possess. However, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was desperately wrong. When she couldn't take it any longer, she rushed to the front and opened the coffin. What happened next was shocking. Dive into this thrilling story now. If you're already familiar with our channel and want to help us keep sharing exciting content, please support us by hitting the like button. Now let's get to the video. While sobbing in front of her son's coffin, Chloe couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She had been searching for answers ever since she identified the body at the morgue, but nothing made sense. The next day, at the funeral, that unsettling feeling had grown into a firm certainty. Chloe shifted in her chair, trying to ease the discomfort in her legs. If she could, she would have pulled her beloved Charles from the coffin where he had been hastily placed that morning. They hadn't even waited for her to say a final goodbye before sealing it, insisting it would be disrespectful to open it again. But the deceased was her son, and as his mother, she felt she had the right to see him one last time. Just then, her brother placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. He was a doctor in the capital and had rushed there to be by her side. During his work hours, he had taken the time to be with her for the funeral. According to him, situations like this happened all the time, but Chloe couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She sat there, her eyes locked on the coffin as if she had laser-like focus. Then, a voice echoed clearly in her mind. "Charles isn't dead, you need to check." For a moment, Chloe was startled by the voice she had heard, but she knew it had come from within herself. Before the minister could finish the sermon, the feeling became undeniable. She had to take one last look at her son, who had once been so full of life, and make sure he was truly gone. But what would she do once she confirmed he wasn't coming back? She would never again see his smile, the one that had always lit up his face, at least until everything started going wrong. For a long time, Charles had been the picture of happiness in Chloe's life. In the last 5 years, he had established his own accounting firm, and his skill in negotiations, combined with his youthful energy, made him a favorite in business circles. He mingled with the upper echelons of the city's society. Just when life seemed to be at its peak, he met Aurora. They had crossed paths in a bar and struck up a conversation. By the third drink, it felt as though they had known each other for a lifetime. Charles and Aurora shared the same passions and interests. They shared the same interests, lived in the same neighborhood, and both worked in business. Aurora was a lawyer at her father's firm, one of the largest in the city. Their relationship progressed quickly, and by the third week, they were inseparable. After 2 months, Charles put his apartment up for sale and moved into her home in a completely different neighborhood from his previous one. Charles's business continued to thrive, but Aurora began subtly urging him to join her father's company. They needed someone with his talents and skills, she said, and there he would have access to more capital, allowing him to take on larger projects. She promised he would still have the freedom to do his work. Eventually, an official offer was made. The proposal was enticing, and it took Charles almost a month to decide to accept it. At first, he hesitated at the thought of giving up his independence to work for a large corporation. But after crunching the numbers, he realized it would take him over 10 years to earn the same amount they were offering. Joining Aurora's father's company would make him a multimillionaire in just a few years. So, he asked her to prepare the contract. The first few months were fantastic. Charles landed major contracts and was able to operate independently most of the time. The projects he developed were innovative, and his structures, Aurora's father, and all the investors were impressed by Charles's financial strategies. He even started working closely with Aurora, which he loved. But then something changed. Charles began hearing troubling rumors about Aurora's father from reliable sources. According to them, his business ethics were questionable. He was ruthless, operated without morals, and used legal and tax loopholes as a matter of routine. This went against everything Charles stood for. He always ensured his dealings were transparent and honest, so the information was accurate and clear. Charles secretly started investigating the company at night after everyone had left the office. He pored over files and examined the accounting records. Aurora's father had a habit of sealing shady deals, and the more Charles dug, the more he realized the rumors were true. Not a single deal was clean, tax fraud was rampant, and a separate set of financial statements was being prepared for the investors of various projects. Aurora's father was pocketing millions in illegitimate profits. It took Charles some time to confront Aurora with what he had discovered. He was stuck in an impossible situation. He loved Aurora, but knew she adored her father. Confronting her would mean forcing her to choose between him and her father. Eventually, he decided he couldn't compromise his integrity. Over dinner at home, Charles told Aurora everything. As he feared, she exploded. "Aurora, I need to tell you something important," he said, trying to stay calm. She looked up from her plate, noticing the seriousness on his face. "What's going on, Charles?" she asked, visibly concerned. "I've discovered some things about your father's company. It wasn't easy, but I had to investigate to be sure. He's involved in fraudulent business." Aurora's expression instantly shifted to a mix of shock and anger. "You've been spying on me?" she shouted, incredulous. "No, Aurora," Charles exclaimed, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not spying on anyone. I just had to verify the allegations. This is serious." "Serious?" she snapped, rising from the table. "You're saying my father, a man who has always been an honest businessman, is doing something illegal, and you think I wouldn't know?" "I'm not saying you know," Charles said, feeling like the ground was crumbling beneath him. "But maybe you don't know everything. I'm just trying to do the right thing here." "The right thing?" Aurora laughed bitterly. "The right thing would be trusting my family, not some baseless accusations. How could you do this to me?" Charles tried to approach her, but she stepped back, crossing her arms. "Aurora, please listen. I'm not against you. I'm trying to protect all of us. If this is true, it could be dangerous." She shook her head, her face contorted with anger. "I can't believe you would do this. You're calling my father a criminal and suggesting that I'm involved. How dare you?" Charles began to feel a growing sense of distrust. How could she react so fiercely without even considering the possibility? Could it be that she knew more than she let on? "Aurora, I need you to be honest with me. Did you know about these deals? Were you aware of what was happening?" She glared at him, her eyes full of anger and hurt. "Get out of my house, Charles. Now." "Aurora, please. Now!" she screamed, pointing to the door. Charles realized there was nothing more to say. He gathered his things and left, his heart heavy, feeling as though his world was collapsing around him. Confused, hurt, and with an uncertain future, Charles checked into a hotel. He stayed up all night thinking about his next move. Based on Aurora's reaction, he was certain she had already told her father about their conversation, which meant his days at the company were numbered. But there was more. Aurora's father was rich and powerful enough to make sure Charles would never. He wouldn't be able to conduct business in his current city or anywhere nearby. In the worst case, it could ruin his ability to do business anywhere in the country, essentially ending his career. Then what would he do? Sell ice cream on the beaches of nearby towns? He had nothing against the idea, but it wasn't exactly what he aspired for in life. The next day, Charles was locked out of his office. 2 large security guards escorted him out of the company building and informed him that he was never allowed to return. He wandered the streets for hours without a clear destination in mind, as he no longer had a place he could call home. In the weeks that followed, Charles fell into a deep depression. Getting out of bed in the morning became almost impossible. He barely slept, and his stomach was so tight that he couldn't eat. Losing Aurora had shattered his heart. He cried. He raged at everything and everyone, and then he cried some more. Eventually, he stopped bathing, wearing the same dirty clothes day after day, sometimes even sleeping in them. He no longer answered his phone and lived like a recluse in his hotel room. Then there was a knock on the door. His mother, Chloe, knew something was wrong with her son. He tried to hide the desperation in his voice every time they spoke, but like any mother, she could tell something wasn't right. She drove through the night to the city, called Aurora to find out where he was staying, and made her way to his hotel room. When he opened the door, Charles ran into her arms and wept. Chloe held him tightly as he cried. When his sobs finally subsided, she sat him down and he told her everything. Most of it was too complicated for her to fully grasp, but Chloe understood the bigger picture. Her son was deeply worried about his future, and the breakup with Aurora was tearing him apart. She suggested he come home with her, stay in his old room for a while, and let her take care of him until he felt better. But Charles's pride wouldn't let him accept, and he turned down all her offers. Eventually, when Chloe left, she gave him a strong hug and started planning to move to his city, at least temporarily, to be closer to him. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was Aurora. She told Charles that the separation had gone on long enough, and she wanted to work things out. She didn't mention her father or offer any apologies, but he hadn't been expecting that anyway. Red flags flashed in Charles's mind, but his longing to have Aurora back overpowered any doubts. Talking to her in person was the first step. "Hi, Charles," she said as she sat down at the bar where they had first met. The conversation was awkward at first, but eventually they relaxed, and suddenly it felt like they were talking as if they had never been apart. Charles's heart swelled with hope. This was all he had ever wanted, to have Aurora by his side again and leave all the pain behind. Charles returned to his hotel room, and suddenly life felt different. The darkness that had clung to him like a second skin for so long was beginning to lift, like fog dissolving in the morning sun. The warning signs still flashed in his mind, but he chose to ignore them completely. Having Aurora back was all that mattered. With her by his side, he felt like he could be unstoppable again. A week later, Charles and Aurora were strolling down the main street in the heart of the city. They had gone out for ice cream, and the world seemed full of mystery once more. Walking hand in hand, Charles felt like reconciliation was just around the corner. It was only a matter of time, and he was ready to be patient. As they were about to cross the street, Charles began to feel dizzy. At first, he thought it was just the heat, but after taking a couple of steps into the crosswalk, the world started spinning. He lost his balance and collapsed. A strange sensation of electricity coursed through his body before he lost consciousness. Aurora immediately called emergency services and waited for the ambulance. The paramedics worked on Charles for 30 minutes, trying to revive him. They loaded him into the ambulance, and one of the paramedics gently approached Aurora. They told her not to get her hopes up. Charles's heart had stopped. And while they would continue treatment en route to the hospital, they believed that the chances were slim. Chloe was just about to settle down for her afternoon nap when she received a formal call from Aurora. Aurora explained that Charles had collapsed in the city, his heart had stopped, and he was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. She spoke with a heavy heart and quickly ended the call. Chloe was left in shock, tears streaming down her face like a waterfall. Something felt wrong. Charles had been improving. He was eating well, had returned to his exercise routine, was sleeping soundly, and was once again making plans for his business. He had been healthy, and Chloe knew this because a mother just knows these things. There was no reason for him to collapse suddenly in the middle of the day at the age of 33. He was still a young man, and despite everything, in good health. The rest of the day passed in a blur. She stayed by his body in the morgue, avoiding the condolences from the hospital staff. Later, Chloe returned home and contacted a funeral director. She explained how she wanted the funeral to be arranged and left the details in their hands. Then, Chloe sat down and cried for the first time. She was still crying when she stood up and approached the coffin. An absolute silence fell over the room, and all eyes were fixed on her. She felt her brother rush towards her, but Chloe reached the coffin first. Grasping the lid with both hands, she pushed it open. Chloe lowered her head onto Charles's chest, sobbing uncontrollably. No one dared to speak. Everyone understood her pain and was willing to let her mourn and scream in her own way. As much as she needed that silence, it was the very reason she heard a single heartbeat. It was faint, followed by a second one. It seemed crazy, paranoia even, but she knew she had heard it. Chloe felt a surge of joy growing inside her. She wrapped her arms around Charles's neck and kissed him on the forehead. When she pulled back, she saw one of his eyelids twitch. It was almost imperceptible, but she knew what she had seen. When her brother reached her, Chloe grabbed him by the shoulders, looked him straight in the eyes and urgently said, "Listen, you have to believe me no matter what. Charles isn't dead. I heard a faint heartbeat, and I saw his left eyelid move. We need to check again before going through with the cremation. We have to take Charles to a hospital, and I want you to be the one to do it." Her brother's face was filled with sorrow. He thought Chloe's grief was driving her to madness. He tried to reason with her, reminding her that a doctor had already checked for vital signs and signed the death certificate. But Chloe was determined. At that moment, the religious figure who was present, well-versed in the processes of grief and mourning, stepped forward and suggested that one final check might give Chloe the peace she needed to begin healing. The doctor knelt beside the coffin, placed 2 fingers on Charles's cold neck, and listened for a heartbeat. His face went pale and he shouted, "He's alive!" He immediately began resuscitation efforts. The necessary procedures were carried out, and an ambulance was called. The man began to gasp and scream, and Chloe, suddenly sobbing again, but for an entirely different reason, realized that her beloved son had come back to her. The last thing she noticed as she left the chapel with the paramedics was Aurora's face, as white as a sheet. 6 weeks later, Charles was well enough to return home, a remarkable turn of events. He had been poisoned with Baku extract, which hadn't killed him but had slowed his metabolism and respiratory system enough to make him appear dead. Without Chloe's persistence and her uncle's medical expertise, he would have been cremated alive. It wasn't the hospital that fought for his life. Aurora, her father, and the doctor who had declared him dead were arrested. The doctor confessed that Aurora's father had offered to fund the doctor's son's education in exchange for a death certificate without an autopsy. Aurora received a 13-year sentence. The doctor lost his medical license and was sentenced to 9 years, and Aurora's father was sentenced to life in prison. As for Charles, he became the CEO of Aurora's father's company, finally running a business with clean practices and unlimited funds. He planned to use this opportunity to make a positive impact on the world. Chloe moved to the same city as her son shortly after the false funeral and Charles. He bought an apartment for her next to his own. She had nearly lost her son again and vowed never to let him out of her sight. This overwhelming feeling drove Chloe to rush toward her supposedly dead son, perhaps a mother's instinct. Let us know in the comments if you enjoyed this emotional story. Please give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Also, check out this other video appearing on your screen now. It's also very touching and will surely move you. See you in the next video.